uh, practitioners who are interested in architecture, art, and sculpture and photography and the synthesis of the arts, which is part of the mission also of T-Space. It was my great pleasure, Vincent, to hear your reading recently as part of the opening event at T-Space in conjunction with Robert Gosvenor's exhibition on show at T-Space. The residents are here on our panel. Welcome Abdullah, Claire, Shrey, Miranda, Alex. And they're joining us from different parts of the world, and they will be on the panel to lead the conversation with Vincent. I think it's a real pleasure to hear from you about your work and your creative process, especially how ideas come about. The residency's theme this year is sublimity. And the residents are producing architectural works through models, through drawings, and finding inspiration and addressing the question of sublimity at large. Together with Stephen Hall, we've been in this process of the residency now only 1 week away from the final presentations. And it's a great pleasure again to have you, Vincent. So I'll pass it on to our resident, Abdullah, to introduce you. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Abdullah, and we are very excited to have Vincent join us today. Vincent Katz is a poet, translator, and critic. He is the author of the poetry collection Daffodil, out this year from Alfred A. Knopf, as well as the collections Broadway for Paul, Southness, among others. He collaborated with Aaron Waldman on the book called Fantastic Caryats and with Andrei Cordescu on a possible epic of Keir. Katz is author of the complete elegies of Sextus Propertius, translations of the Roman love poet. He is also the editor of Black Mountain College, Experiment in Art, MIT, and his writing on contemporary art and poetry has appeared in Art in America, Apollo, Art News, Parquet, and Brooklyn Rail. He lives in New York City. Welcome, Vincent. And we're looking forward to your conversation with you today.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Abdullah, and thank you, Irene, and thank you all for being here. Yeah, this is an exciting opportunity for me. I'm interested. It's been basically a long-standing experience in my life. The synthesis of the arts or the interactions among the arts. It grew up around a lot of visual art and also poetry and dance. Um, and so I'm primarily a poet, but I'm also an art critic. I've organized exhibitions. And I've also taught at School of Visual Arts in New York and the School of the Arts at Yale University. And I've tried to bring in different aspects. One of them is kind of different ways of writing about art. In other words, at SVA, we're working with David Levi Strauss a lot on how different people could see the arts and write about them, one of which being poets. And there's a tradition of poets being influenced by visual art and writing about it. Um, and I was thinking also of this important um, definition or delineation that Ezra Pound made when he described poetry. He said it could be divided into logopoia, phanopoia, and melopoia. Um, so so poia is poesis is the making of something, and so logopoia is like the sense, the logic or the meaning, the idea in a poem. The phanopoia is making an image appear with words in this case, but it could be through other means. And melopoia is the music or the melody, the sound that's so important in poetry. So I just thought it was kind of brilliant of him to identify those three things because it's true. Any kind of poetry has them all in different proportions and different emphases. Um, And I wanted to talk a little bit about my process as a poet, and then go on to discuss a project I'm working on now that involves writers and visual artists. But I was thinking about when I was teaching at Yale, one of the things that I had the students do, I feel like we're all really bound to screens these days. Like we're all, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else, but like looking at our phones, just like whenever there's an empty space, if we're even just taking an elevator up in a building, we feel like, oh, that's lost time. I better look on my phone and see what's happening. And so I'm a big fan of boredom and just, the idea of, wow, what would it be like if I'm waiting for somebody here and they said they'd be here in 5 minutes. What if I don't go on my phone? What if I just like look and see what happens? And, there's always something happening. It doesn't matter whether you're in the country or the city or anywhere. Um, so I was trying to get my students at Yale to do that. I would give them an exercise, take a break and just go outside and look at something. And then we had models of poetry we were using. And so use one of those models and try to write about it. So I'm gonna make a case for this object here, the notebook, the actual physical notebook with a pen or pencil. I feel like this is a really good thing to have on hand. Obviously, we can take notes in our phones, but it's a totally different experience. So I like to actually have something like this. I mean, first of all, I don't have to be connected to anything, but second of all, just the way you write or draw in a actual physical book and a support, and you have a relationship with it, so to speak. You push against it and it pushes back. Um, I find really important. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. I would really just recommend that everybody have a practice that involves not being on a machine and a screen. Um, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about, so a lot of my process is based on looking, and I've been influenced by, for example, the poet James Schuyler, and a lot of his poems seem to be just this simple act of looking out the window, let's say. Um, and he just describes things, but in his act of describing an attention, he all of a sudden there's something that happens in this poem. It's almost inevitable. Like this moment occurs, like something happens. It could even just be a change in the light, but oftentimes it's something else more, dramatic, let's say, like a bird alighting on a branch or something. Um, that note of. So a lot of my poems are like that. A lot of them actually have written in this notebook or a notebook like this. I got into a process at the end of 2023 where I was just not editing myself in advance, and I would just say, "Well, I can write about anything. I'm going to try this as an experiment to just take notes in my book, but not, I shouldn't say take notes, actually write poetry. So that there's a difference there. Like I was trying to write already lines of poetry, words of poetry, but I wasn't writing about anything. I didn't have an idea in mind in advance. That's in a way the main way that I write, although there's lots of different variations within that. Um, but I wanted to actually share something that is a little unusual for me, but it turned out to be important because it turned out to be the title poem of my book, Daffodil. This is the book that I read from at T-Space. And so I'm going to share with you a little secret that not everybody knows, which is that this poem, Daffodil, which is the first poem in this book, is based on the first poem in this book, Lunch Poems by Frank O'Hara, which is called Music. So still on the topic of music and melopoeia. And by the way, I recommend that you get a copy of this book. This is just like almost deep connection with people and friends and the environment, which is usually New York City, but there's also other places in it. So I thought I would read O'Hara's poem, Music, which is the first poem in this book. Sorry, this copy's falling apart a little bit, but if you can see it there, that's Music by Frank O'Hara. And then I'll read Daffodil. So this poem is from 1953. Music. If I rest for a moment near the equestrian, pausing for a liver sausage sandwich in the Mayflower shop, that angel seems to be leading the horse into Bergdorf's, and I am naked as a tablecloth, my nerves humming, close to the fear of war and the stars which have disappeared. I have in my hands only 35 cents. It's so meaningless to eat. And gusts of water spray over the basins of leaves like the hammers of a glass pianoforte. If I seem to you to have lavender lips under the leaves of the world, I must tighten my belt. It's like a locomotive on the march, the season of distress and clarity. And my door is open to the evenings of midwinter's lightly falling snow over the newspapers. Clasp me in your handkerchief like a tear trumpet of early afternoon in the foggy autumn. As they're putting up the Christmas trees on Park Avenue, I shall see my daydreams walking by with dogs in blankets, put to some use before all those colored lights come on. But no more fountains and no more rain, and the stores stay open terribly late. So that's music. And now I'll read Daffodil. Daffodil. If I imagine all time sequestered in the fold of a daffodil, close to the desire of sitting next to someone, it's like a trip uptown and then one downtown, and my door is open to the revenge of snow. Clasp me as a trumpet seeks release. I should see daydreams in eyes, all aflutter and simplified down. The stores and all the other places we settle down to. So that's, excuse me, that's part of my process, which is relates to an earlier phase in my life in a way when I was very influenced by um, the first generation New York school poets, including Schuyler and O'Hara, and also John Ashbery and Kenneth Koch. Um, and I tried to write poems that were based on theirs. And so I feel like that's a really useful thing to do, by the way. It's not something I do ordinarily now, but I think that was coming out of the pandemic. I was rereading this book and I was kind of delving more deeply into how O'Hara puts ideas and phrases together. And then I thought I would share something more of how I usually work. So these are some notebook pages I'll hold up and then I'll read the poem. So you can kind of see how I write. I write, you know, there's not a lot of editing going on at the time. I'm just trying to get, but yet they're not notes. They're actual line. I'm trying to get the sounds and the rhythms and the lines in place already. So I'm kind of editing in my head in advance in a way. And then later I'll go back and see if I like it or not. I might scrap the whole thing or I might keep part of it. But I tend to keep a lot of this material. It seems to be something that is working as a method. And there's a little, you can see the notations of where I've written them. I always like to try to take note of when and where I wrote something. And then if it comes to publish it, I don't include that on the page usually, but sometimes I include it in the back or in a note section. So the only thing that really got changed here was I was taking the subway and I passed this silver cup sign and noodle, and I couldn't see what the other word was. But then when I came back, I saw it was noodle factory. So then I added it in. But basically, that was all. And then this is the end of it on this side here. So that was written a little bit later. And then I wrote this the next day, and I thought it could maybe be part of it, but then I realized it wasn't, it didn't make sense as part of it. First I had it together, and then I made it its own thing, which I'm not sure if I what I think about that part yet. So that's an example of something where I wrote it at the time, and having these notes helps me. I don't know, for some reason I like to remember because the way I write, I don't use a lot of specifics. Um, I tend to try to have done in the past, but more recently I try to leave out like place names, let's say like that, like whatever street names or even specific times of day. I rather try to have the description evoke that. So maybe if you're paying close enough attention, you might be able to tell where it is or the type of place it is or the time of day it is. But as a result, I sometimes, if I don't take these notes, I'll forget, and it kind of intrigues me. Like, well, wait a minute, where exactly was I? And then so if I have these notes, like, oh yeah, now I remember I was walking down that hallway in that gallery building, and it was the middle of summer, and everything was closed, and that's why I wrote, it's interesting to be the only one here at all. It's the season that does it, the sultry weather. Um, so now I'll read that poem that I showed you the notes from, which is different. I think it's a little bit different from Daffodil. Let's see if I can. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay. So this is from I'm trying to do something different from what I've done in my previous two books. Um, anyway, this new work that I'm working on, I'm trying to make it about places more than my personal experience. So this is part of this sequence called Places. The sun descends the sky, shade covers this side of the field. The day's heat diminished, lush trees full of summer surround the grass, leaves illuminated in late afternoon gold. Behind the silver cup sign and noodle factory, the train brings the faithful to their breeze. Images, buildings stand out as they can. The field spread out before us now. It is a pattern they and we submit to. The ball floats so high forever before falling and being caught. A man stands in the field and knows what his position is. The shadow also has meaning. It is always changing slightly, is encroaching now. The lines, diagonals against horizontals, on grass below the screams. Um, so I think now I'd like to share my screen and talk a little bit about three artists. This is a book I'm working on that is also going to be an exhibition at Colby College Museum of Art in 2027, and it's called A Shared Life. It's about the lives and work of the poet and dance critic Edwin Denby, the photographer and filmmaker Rudy Burkhart, and the painter Yvonne Jacquet, and they all live together. They form this kind of unusual family structure that I want to think about and write about, and also, the people around them and how people or how artists have created these support systems that I feel are necessary to the making of art because there's not always a lot of recognition out there, and people tend to often think of recognition in terms of, financial reward, but I think there's a lot, it's more important the psychological and emotional support that artists and other people interested in the arts give each other. So let's see if I can do this. Okay. Give me a second. Here we go. How's that? Is that working?
Great, yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to go through this slideshow. Um, and so, there are notes there, so you can kind of pick up on some of these people or some of the information that I'm giving. This is Edwin Denby, who was born in 1903. His father was a diplomat, so he spent part of his early life in Vienna, and then he came back and went to Hotchkiss, and from there to Harvard. And I was recently examining his archives in Harvard, and I've been intrigued by the fact that he basically dropped out, even though he was one of the top students in high school of his time. Um, but yeah, he had some, I think it was basically the macho culture. As I was looking through these yearbooks and things, like all they talked about was sports. It was incredible. Like they didn't give any, there were other clubs and organizations. There was the Harvard Advocate and, obviously all these things, but they didn't get mentioned at all. It was all about how the sports teams did. And you looked at the young men, they were all men, and they all look kind of great. They all look like they could have been in a Fitzgerald short story, but it was a very kind of, you could also feel it was kind of a rigid environment. And I feel like didn't feel like he fit in. So he did something pretty dramatic. He ran away twice. The first time his mother really implored him to come back, and then the second time he just left with his friend and they went to Vienna, and he enrolled in a dance school, and then he became a dancer and then eventually a dance critic. There's some other photos of him. And so he was a dance critic and a poet, and he almost by chance, in a way, became one of the most important dance critics of his time. He was a champion of George Balanchine and also wrote um, really fascinating pieces on Martha Graham, and then many other dancers went from Merce Cunningham and Paul Taylor era up until Robert Wilson. He actually was a big supporter of Robert Wilson when Wilson started to work, and then Wilson invited him to collaborate on a couple of pieces. So just had like a very fascinating trajectory. But as I say, it was almost accidental because each time he got a gig, an important gig as a critic, it was because somebody else suggested him. The first time was Aaron Copland said to the magazine Modern Music, you should hire Denby to write about dance. And then the second time, Virgil Thompson's suggested him um, in the 40s to write for the New York Herald Tribune. Oh, this is from his dance days, his own when he was a dancer, and in this duo with Claire Eckstein. And I love these photographs because they just show, I mean, it's so great that we have these because you get both the impact of their performances, but also their relationship as friends. So they toured Germany for about 2 years. It's a poem. I'm just going to go a little quickly through some of these things. Some of these are ephemera. So now this whole slideshow is in chronological order. So it's going to interleave these three different people ultimately. Rudy Burkhart was born in Basel and he was born in 1914. So he was 11 years younger than Denby. And they met when Demby was in Basel and needed a passport photo, and someone said, Burkhart could take your photo, and then they fell in love and had an affair and went to Paris and saw Picasso exhibitions um, and then eventually moved to New York together in 1934. And then Burkhart was already making photographs from his early days in Europe. But then he got a 16 millimeter film camera and started making films. And so they were friends with a circle that included Orson Welles when he was still in New York and very young, um, and people I mentioned, Aaron Copland and Virgil Thompson, and also Paul Bowles. And then it just kept going through the years, as different young artists would come to New York, they often collaborated with them and made films together. These are some of his journals. I mean, Rudy is an example of a person who is greater than the sum of his parts. He's a photographer, a filmmaker, a painter, an actor, and also a writer and a journal keeper. So these are some examples of the visual quality of his journals. That's a Burkhart photo of Denby on the roof of their apartment on West 21st Street near 7th Avenue. These are some artworks by friends of theirs, artists that they knew that were, you know, gifts to them. It shows a little bit of their cultural milieu. This is part of Denby's process. This is how he struggled with writing prose, and his poetry writing process was similar too. So, unlike what I was describing, I've been attracted to the idea of, I guess I would say, like, being a little non-judgmental when you're in the creative act, like when I'm writing a poem, or even afterwards when I look at it. I kind of have to get it right the first time. Like it either works or doesn't work most of the time. But Denby was a different school of poetry composition where he really chiseled and took words out and added different words in. And this is his prose writing. He he did write some pieces about Burkhart, which are really insightful, but he was trying to write a longer work on Burkhart that he never finished, and a lot of this shows his attempts to do that. These are some Burkhart photographs from these are from the early days. He was 20 years old and still living in Basel here. And then, as I say, they got to know, people in the art world. De Kooning was a neighbor. They met just because they were neighbors, and then became very enamored of him and his work. And they had a little bit of money, and they would buy some of his paintings occasionally. He wasn't selling it. That was way before he even had a show in a gallery, 10 years before his first gallery show. But the cost of living was very cheap then. These are some really interesting experimental pieces that Burkhart, when he first came to New York, he couldn't take in the whole scope of it. He said it was like he couldn't see the tall buildings and the details and the people at the same time, so he just decided to do up close fragments, which I think are really remarkable. And I love the way he kind of focuses on fashion elements and style. That was always something he was interested in. He traveled a lot throughout, just not throughout, but in certain parts of the States and also back to Europe, and always has this to me, very evocative, humanistic relationship with the people he photographs, whether it's just people he encounters or artists in their studios. His photographs of artists are interesting because they seem to not be posing for him. They seem to forget he's there and he's just one of them in a way. And I feel like he was able to do that even among people he didn't know at all. He also didn't take a lot of uh, photographs. So something like this, he would just he did a number of these pieces where he would go to the top floor in a building, go on the roof and photograph, but he would maybe only take three, something like this, you know. So he wanted to somehow preserve the moment. His process had a lot to do with being in the moment, a lot of times down on the street with the people or in the subway. But even up here, I feel like he didn't want to belabor the um, the aspect of it that was art making. He wanted art making to be integrated into his life. And I think for him, speed and precision was part of it. This is a page from his memoir, Mobile Homes, and that was his first wife, Edith Schloss, who was a painter. His photograph. More of Denby's process. This is for a film they did based on Frankenstein. It's kind of comic, but also romantic, like German romantic a little bit. These are some great flyers for when they would show their films, photos, family photos. These are stills from various films from different eras. And the lower left is Taylor Mead with two other actors. The one above that is this funny um, film they did called Shoot the Moon in the early 1960s that was in a way based on Georges Méliès's Voyage to the Moon. And it had the same kind of roughness in the animation. And then above that is yeah, a film of boys swimming in the river in the East River. So these are some painting and a drawing by Alex Katz, my father, which include in the painting Rudy Burkhart's on the far left and Denby's on the right with white hair with a cigarette over his head. It just kind of shows how the integration of these social communities and the same kind of some of the same people in New York. It's Burkhart and Denby on the right. And then Yvonne Jacquet was quite a bit younger and was Rudy's second wife. And this is some of her early work where she also was focusing on kind of fragments and details. And then she started to do this work, which were aerial views from usually from airplanes, sometimes from high buildings if it was a city. And these are some of Rudy's later photos, which I feel like he really got into this whole it's of a piece with those early photos that we saw from the late 30s of different fragments of people. Now he's kind of been able to pull back and have buildings and people in the same frame sometimes, but still like very empathetic to the people he photographs and still kind of focusing on their fashion and their style, their hair, which I find really great. So it's kind of like a balance. I find this great formal balance, which I attribute to his being imbued with, classical painting and architecture. But he's able to do that on the spot in these moments that are moving by very quickly, and also with his, as I say, like humanity and empathy. These kind of funny found poems that he would make, poem collages. All right, I guess we have time for some questions. Should we shift to that phase?
Thank you very much, Vincent. Really insightful, uh, very helpful the way you presented this broad spectrum, different processes, and your own and others. And I found it really animating. It kind of imbues love for life in a very direct way. Um, um, I think there's lots to unpack here, so I'm curious where our residents want to start.
Yeah.
As well as people from the audience, you can feel free to type questions using the Q&A button or just in the chat.
We can start. Um, Hi, Vincent. Thank you very much for your talk. It was incredibly inspiring, and I take a lot of inspiration from poetry as an approach to architecture, in my work as a designer and artist. So, um, I was thinking about the well-known quote that architecture is a frozen music, and that conversely, music is a liquid architecture. Um, and perhaps poetry is kind of in between them. With, I guess, the scale being the speed at which you perceive, the speed of perception. Um,
Hmm.
as a poet, do you find yourself playing with speed, not in the way you create the work, but also in the way you present and read the work and think about the speed at which one can perceive and at which something can become legible or illegible?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I like to think about speed because I feel like everything's always going by so quickly. And nowadays, more and more quickly, just because there's so much more information, we're trying to, make sense of a lot of it because a lot of it is really important and interesting. Um, and having grown up in New York City, speed was always a part of it too, just because of how people move. And so, yeah, I mean, I've been inspired by those photographs, but that I was showing by Rudy Burkhardt because he's able to be a participant. And so I think that's how I like to think of my poetry a lot of the times, like that and I actually do write on the street a lot. So I feel like I'm a participant even in my writing. And then, just on like a humorous note, sometimes people will actually say like, "Hey, what are you writing in that notebook?" So you are sometimes literally a participant. But I like the contingency factor of it that you could get jostled or you have to cross the street or you can't cross the street because the light changes and you miss something. Um, so that's part of it. Um, in terms of, I think the second part of your question though is really interesting is like the perception of poetry. Again, I mean, just because there's so many things vying for our attention, everything has to be quick, and poetry is actually really good at being quick because, for example, I don't really like to read on a Kindle or something like that. Like I'd much rather, if it's a novel or a nonfiction book, I want to have it in my hands because I want to be able to flip back and forth. But poetry, ironically, works better because you usually get one poem on a page, and so you can actually get the whole poem, before you have to go on to your next screen. So that's a kind of speed. There's a speed even in just one line, like a one line of poetry usually grabs you or doesn't grab you. It's like you usually that's like, oh, that's something I want to read more of, or I don't need to read that. Happens very instantaneously. I often feel like I can tell if I'm going to like a poem almost at first glance, kind of like with a painting or a building or a work of visual art. There's that first impression that then, of course, deepens and changes and becomes more complex. But your first imp you fall in love, or you maybe don't not interested in something almost at first glance, right, with the work of visual art. And I feel like something similar happens with poetry. Any other thoughts out there?
Maybe
Questions?
a bit more practical in its approach, but I really love your concept or overarching theme as kind of life as the creative practice and with the notebook and carrying it around with you. And it's like every moment of every day can kind of turn into an act of creation. So I was curious if anything that you've learned from putting together the exhibition or from your own life of rhythms that kind of keep you in the flow of that, or like how do you carve space around to like actually finalize projects and meet deadlines and all the practical things where there's like one sense of note taking but then in the other sense of finalizing.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So that's a struggle, I feel, for most of us.
Vincent, we lost you for a few seconds, so
Oh,
you
okay.
may want to repeat. Yes,
Am I back?
you're
Can you
back
hear
now.
me?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Oh, thanks. I was just saying that I feel like it's a struggle to have the time to write in my case. So when I'm actually writing, when I finally get to write, like this, when I'm writing on this book, um, there's this kind of feeling of enjoyment and oh, this is what I really like to do. But there are all these other things that we all have to do in order to get to that moment, I feel like. And some people are better than others, or they have worked out a way in their lives that allows them more time in the studio, let's say. Um, I've just had to find ways of doing it, you know, on the run to get back to the previous question, and also another reason to have a notebook with you because you never know when you're going to just see something that you want to write or jot down. In terms of finishing things, um, I feel like it's just discipline. Like you have to be an artist, you have to be very disciplined because again, there are all these other, I don't want to call them distractions because they're all very important things in our lives, but at a certain point they're distractions because you want to just focus and as you said, finish and complete your work. So at this point in time, I feel like I'm very I do sometimes I get asked to do poems as commissions, which I like. I find it very challenging. Um, and I'm doing one now. I did one recently for the Met. It was their exhibition called The New Art about early photography, but they're going to post it on their website when the catalog is released. So sometime in the next few months, if you want to look it up, there's some poems that I wrote that go with specific early daguerreotypes from this exhibition called The New Art. Um, and then right now I'm writing poems for a Portuguese artist, Carla Felipe, and she sent me a group of 24 photographs that she's taken of abandoned train stations in Portugal. And I'm writing poems, and I it's funny, like I'm in a way writing them as fast as I can, partially because I quote unquote don't have a lot of time, but of course I wouldn't ever say that about something that I'm writing because I would eventually give it the time I need to make sure it's okay. But actually that becomes part of the process. I kind of like that like very quick writing approach. Look at her photograph and I keep responding to it. So there's a certain, but that relates to both questions really, the speed of approach, but also the idea that you want to finish something because there's a deadline and this person wants something and I want to get it done. Um, so yeah, it's a kind of discipline that just is a lifelong practice in itself. How do you know, I guess related on a related topic, I used to give myself an hour, like a specific hour of the day every day. I think it was like from 9 to 10, where I would just write poetry or think about poetry. I didn't even have to write that much, but I would give myself that time. So that's another thing. Oh, and another one that I really like is the poet Philip Larkin, who had his day job was as a librarian. So he had to work 9 to 5, but he made sure that every day he wrote for 2 hours. So I feel like if you do that consistently, like every day or almost every day, that gives you the ability to proceed and to finish things.
Vincent. Hi, Vincent. Thank you so much for your great lecture. This is like
Hi.
really personal to me, specifically because right now I'm also on, on a trip in Italy. I'm traveling, and as you said, I do keep myself a written journal here, and I do use a film camera to capture, different sort of like moments. I think the 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 part about the physicality of recording is the constraint of it. Specifically with like film camera, I realize I actually spend a lot of time just framing things before
Hmm.
I press the capture the shutter button. Uh,
Yeah.
it's sort of like the similar thing I feel with writing. It's almost I need some sort of like a framework or some sort of
Hmm.
constraints, like I don't know the just the cost of the film, right?
Right.
Makes me very slow at capturing. Do you
Hmm.
have any sort of like this kind of constraint when you're traveling, and when you're writing? Because for me, I want to write about everything, but I sort of just lose myself in a in a process of just jogging down my memory, right? Do you ask
Hmm.
yourself some questions or just something that keeps you having like a theme or something? Um, or is just quite random for you as well when you're traveling?
Um, well, if I understand you, you're asking, what I'm understanding from your question is this idea of, what you're writing down. Like, is it, and if it becomes too much, because sometimes if we take a lot of notes or
Right,
something,
right.
we don't
Exactly.
necessarily read them again because, you know, I don't know, they don't read, let's put it that way. But, um, there's a theory that the taking note practice in itself is important. Like people say that, if you take notes in a class, even if you don't read them again, it's a way of kind of monitoring the ideas in your head as you're taking notes. So I think taking notes is always useful. But what I do is I'm not usually taking notes. I'm usually trying to write poems. So I'm already trying to get words and phrases into units that are part of a potential poem. So that's just me personally because I'm a poet. Um, but I like what you were saying about the idea of using film and the kind of how you have to, or you want to think a little bit more before you press the shutter, and that gives you a different um, relationship to the image because, when we're on our phones or a digital format, we can just shoot indefinitely. And I feel like sometimes that's a drawback. I mean, sometimes it's great, obviously, but sometimes it can be a drawback. It's just like too much information. But I'm glad you're doing that.
I wonder what are sort of like some of the key questions that you keep interrogating yourself when you're writing poems. Uh,
I mean, one of them is like, is this repetitive of things I've done before, or not so much early on, I think it was like, is it derivative of other people? And when I first started writing, I didn't really care. I had this friend group that, we wrote together and shared poetry together, and we talked about writing imitations. We wanted to write imitations of poems that we liked, and we would show them to each other. So at that point, I felt like that didn't even care if it was called derivative. We just were excited about these other poets and we wanted to try to write like them. And then as time went on, I didn't want to sound exactly like them. So I added some other things in. In my case, it was I studied the classics. I studied ancient Greek and Latin, and I got very excited and involved with those poets. And that's a whole different way. Well, the Roman poets kind of relate to the New York poets, but it's just a different way of writing. So that added something different. And then I got interested in the beat poets and the Black Mountain College poets who were, Robert Creeley mainly and John Wieners and Charles Olson. So that added different elements. And I just think but I guess the questions I ask myself now are more along the lines of if it's too repetitive, if it's too reminiscent of something I've done before. I mean, that's something that I've encountered throughout my life as a poet, where I sometimes tried to give myself obstacles or, constraints, as you said. Um, but the way I've done it is not so much, you know, in experimentalism, but more so I've used collaboration. I've done a number of collaborations with visual artists and a couple with other poets. And I feel like collaboration is something that really gets you out of your comfort zone. At the same time that it's great to have a little mini group that's working together. I did a book with the painter Wayne Gonzalez called Judge during the George W. Bush administration, and um, it was when he got to nominate a judge to the Supreme Court. Um, it was John Roberts, and I knew that he was going to get confirmed just, when they announced that it was just like inevitable, and it was very depressing, and there was a sense of foreboding, and I didn't want to write about it per se, so I did this book length poem, which was all words taken from the New York Times, but kind of reconfigured. I was trying to focus on not so much on what they were saying, but how they were saying it. So I was focusing on the adverbs and the, adjectives and these kind of words that they were throwing around kind of casually in their articles. And Wayne's work was doing something similar with visual imagery that he was, a lot of times taking from the internet and then transforming. And so we totally on board with the whole idea of it. And they said to us, well, you can we said we have some really crazy ideas for the design. Like we want words to just trail off the page. We want to have things upside down. We want to do full bleeds, and they just allowed us to do whatever we wanted. So it was in that time, in that moment, it just felt really good to have this. It felt like a group, even though there were just two of us, but it was good to have somebody else with you to kind of do something in response to this terrible political moment, you know, and I've had other responses um, at different times. But yeah, I feel like so collaboration's one way I've changed my poetry. Um, Translation has also had an impact on it. So I try to get out of, I try to avoid getting into a rut or, you know, getting into like a, yeah, repetitive mode. I don't like to feel like I've discovered anything and then that's going to be it forever.
I guess going off of that, my question was like, do you think you can collaborate with time, I guess, and almost see your past versions of yourselves as someone to collaborate with?
Well, that's an interesting question. Collaborate with time. I mean, you have to in a way at the end of the day. Um, and yeah, you're always at a different phase in your life and you have different relationship to the people in your life. So you are collaborating with time. And I try to have my poetry um, reference things that are going on around me. Um, in terms of collaborate with the earlier things I've done, I don't know. I don't think so, not so much, but in a way, as I started out with that Frank O'Hara poem, was Frank O'Hara was a poet that has been important to me since I was a teenager. So in that way, I don't go back to myself too much, although I did do selected poems, and so in that for that project, I did go back to my earliest poems and kind of go through them, and that was also it was being translated into Italian, so I was working with the translator. Um, it's interesting to go back and see what you did. I don't ever want to change anything except maybe like one word or something like that. I feel like it is what it is. It's like a mark of the time of that period. Um, but yeah, I think it's interesting to me to go back to certain things that were important that are still important, you know, then some change and they're not so important. But another one that I might teach a workshop on Charles Olson's book, The Maximus Poems, which is his epic poem he wrote based on the city of Gloucester, where he spent the end of, you know, the last years of his life. Um, so that in a way is going back to, yeah. So there is, I think there is a going back, but for me, it's going back to other writers, not so much to my own writing.
I just have one comment where you talked about like intentionally leaving a few things and not like clearly giving the meaning of the whole space or like if a whole sort of environment into your poetry.
Mm,
And I think it sort of gives the poetry or any work of art, even architecture, this ambiguity, which,
mhm.
you know, which doesn't limit its meaning. And it kind of, do you think it also becomes, you know, for different people to perceive it in different ways? Because the meaning is not absolute and it does not limit the art form.
Yeah, 100%. It's funny because that you say that because I've had people say things to me about my poems that, you know, are totally not what I was literally thinking about. They're saying like, "Oh, that really is such and such," and then I can see it. I say, "Oh yeah, I see that. That wasn't what I was thinking of at the time." So I think, yeah, I do. Um, I think it's a kind of a style that, well, for one thing, it was a way of again differentiating my poetry from the poetry of Frank O'Hara and other poets who have a lot of detailed information in their poems. Um, but also, I think as a result of reading a lot of Roman poetry and Greek poetry, there's this sense of a style being kind of like a, I don't know what word to use. I mean, I think the technical word is a grand style, but I don't want to use that word because it's too grandiose. But it's a style that's a little bit larger and less specific. It's less honed to the specific details of your environment, which I have nothing against. I think there's so much great work that is literally about the specific emotions, but is also generalized or, universalized, let's say.
Vincent, there is a comment in our Q&A. You may be able to see it if you hit the Q&A button and read
Oh,
it
yeah.
go over it. I can try to read it also. Or do you want to do it?
Do you want to read it? Yeah, I can see it.
Hi, I have a comment, says Nafil Qureshi. Your work is inspiring to all of us. It reminds me of the work of German artist Kurt Schwitters' work, where he's worked mostly about documenting experiences using generic or ordinary found object. It also reminds me of the quote from architect Lebbeus Woods that we have to think as general to fully understand human experience in time and space.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think both things are true. For me, it's that right now the challenge is to make the specific moment feel unlimited. I guess I'd phrase it that way, which I feel like relates a little bit to your topic of the sublime, because the sublime is kind of like a grander style. I'm not, involved in the romantic sense of awe or um, those aspects of the sublime, but I think the idea that, yeah, that our each of our lives is very important and precious, but also partially because it relates to something larger. Um, and so in my poetry, I'm trying to have both things be present.
It's interesting since you're bringing up the sublime. We're thinking of, in our different discussions here in the residency, as a question of scale, of
Mm,
making the human experience or the human feel small or insignificant in relationship to elements or the context within which we're in. Do you have any thoughts perhaps about not so much to romanticize this experience, but that dramatic contrast in scale and how
mm.
maybe it comes across in poetry?
Well, one thing that comes to mind to me is Rudy Burkhart, as I mentioned earlier, when he came from Basel and he said, everything was kind of on the same scale, on the human size scale, the buildings. And then when he came to New York City, he couldn't almost perceive the scale. It took him a few years, and then finally and he was able to photograph tall buildings and people. Um, that's what it reminds me of for mostly. In terms of poetry, again, I think of scale as something, yeah, large scale, which I'm interested in. I've always thought that it was a challenge for a poet to try to engage in as many genres or forms of poetry as possible. Not that a poet has to do that, but it's a possibility. It's out there. Like poet might want to try to write an epic poem. Epic is sort of a troubled genre, I'd say, because the original epics were about military valor, and I don't think we don't give that the same value as they once did. But these more modern epics, like the one I mentioned, the Maximus poems, is more about place. It's about this specific place, Gloucester, Massachusetts. He talks about the colonial aspect of it, like the invasion and the colonialism of it, but also what was going on in his present day. So there's a scale to it. It's made up of different parts, but it has a scale. Um, Allen Ginsberg's poem Kaddish, written about his mother, about the death of his mother specifically, I think has that scale. John Ashbery has a couple of long poems. Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror is one. Um, I think about it a lot in terms of my prose writing, actually, when I write an article, or in this case, a book, um, the idea of scales to be able to hold the reader's attention from the beginning to the end. That I think is the greatest challenge of any work of art that's time-based, like a piece of music. Um, so I'm interested in that. Yeah, I haven't really tried to. I mean, I wrote this book with Andre Codresco. We collaborated on a book called A Possible Epic of Care, because when I taught a workshop on epic, that's how I ended it with this talk saying, we can't write military epics. The epic of place is already now a little dated. That was from the middle of the last century. William Carlos Williams has a great poem called Paterson. That's a book-length poem about Paterson, New Jersey. Um, then there've been other Alice Notley and Anne Waldman and Diane DePrima have written epics. Um, but we tried to write an epic of care. It was during the first days of the pandemic, and so I feel like that poem is readable. It's in a way like a notebook. It has lots of different elements in it, including a lot of it is music I was listening to at the time, um, and other things. And then a number of people died who were friends of ours during that time, so that there are kind of these little sections that are elegies to people. Um, anyhow, yeah, I'm interested in that idea of scale and poetry. Also, I'm interested in like the very short poem, like that poem I read to you, Daffodil, is 8 lines long. I feel like a lot of poets shy away from the shorter poems. Their poems are usually like a page to 2 pages or something like that.
Vincent, I think this was incredible. I very much appreciate the intimacy and the inspiration that comes out of this conversation and your presentation. And unless there is any last comment, I think we've maxed out on our time. Very appreciative of that, and would love to continue having conversations with you in different capacities in the future.
Oh, terrific. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I've really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Vincent. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.